There's a toolbar that'll pop up and say participants. If you click that, you'll get a little white window show up on the right-hand side, and you'll see the hand-raising icon at the bottom. And for councillors, when votes are necessary, we'll be using the yes/no buttons that are down there as well.
Thank you, Tim. We're now going to go to Terry, who will do a roll call.
Chair Redmond?
Here.
Councillor Clark?
Here.
Councillor Galloway?
Here.
Councillor Jowett?
Here.
Councillor Strickland?
Here.
All are present.
Thank you very much. And for anyone who's wondering, Councillor Strickland wasn't able to be here, and we're going to do council later. And it's because I'm here physically, I offered to chair for him, so I'm happy to fill in. Are there any declarations? Seeing none. Our first report is financial statements of the Region of Waterloo Community Housing, Inc. for the fiscal year ending December 31st, 2019. This is for information, but I would hand it over to Mr. Dyer to review the report, and then we can have a discussion.
Yep, so thank you, Madam Chair. So the first report on the agenda today are the financial statements for the Region of Waterloo Community Housing, Inc. For the year ended December 31st. These are presented here for information, and just as a reminder of the way it works, the statements were approved by the board, the ROCI board, earlier this month. And so they're provided here for information. They are consolidated within the overall regional financial statements, which we'll be looking at as the next report, and of course are attached to the as part of the agenda. I think as council is aware, so ROCI basically looks after two properties, the two previous La Capana properties, which since January 15th have been owned by ROCI. There's two properties, one in Kitchener, one in Cambridge. Financial statements prepared by staff, reviewed by KPMG, and are presented here again for information. Overall, ROCI has about $1 million a year operating budget. There were no issues of any significance raised as part of the audit, and again are here for the committee's information.
Thank you very much. So again, just to underscore, we're receiving this for information. There is no motion needed. Are there any questions or comments before we go on to the next agenda item? Councillor Clark.
Thank you. The question's for staff, and it's really not relating to the statements. I just want to confirm, our regular housing department manages this. It's simply hived off financially, right? It doesn't have any other particular organizational.
Yes.
I see Craig nodding. Okay.
So that's correct. That's correct. A staff team comprising the housing, facilities, and finance collectively kind of manage those two properties. And yes, that's absolutely correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I see no further questions or comments, so we'll go on to the next report, which is the financial statements for the fiscal year ending December 31st, 2019. And again, I would look to Mr. Dyer for a report.
So thank you, Madam Chair. We have the 2019 financial statements for the committee's review and approval today. There's three sets of statements, being the region's consolidated financial statements, the sinking fund financial statements, and the trust fund statements. And there are two brief presentations that we'll take you through today. I'll provide the first one, which is kind of an overview of the kind of the highlights, if you will, of the financial statements. And then Mr. Betik has his audit report presentation as well. So if it's acceptable to the committee, I have the presentation opened, and if all goes well, when I share my screen, you should all be able to see it.
Aha.
It worked.
Excellent. Excellent. So now I'm just going to see what I need to do to get a slideshow going. Okay. Great. So we started this process last year of basically, trying to take, a fairly long, somewhat complicated set of financial statements and try to provide some of the highlights and key messages out of them. So staff have gone through and we've presented, and then there's maybe 8 or 10 slides here that will just walk you through the highlights, key items that we think audit committee needs to know about as they review the statements. And really, we're trying to answer the question, what do these statements say about the region's financial health? And it's fine to get 1 year, but we've actually gone back and looked at trends over the last 6 or 7 years, and to look at some of the actions that we're taking to help ensure long-term financial sustainability. And of course, in the most recent strategic plan approved by council, there are some financial sustainability measures included in that strategic plan. So we're going to go through these. I'll go through them relatively quickly. Certainly happy to answer questions as we go along. The first piece we wanted to look at was, so straight off the balance sheet, we look at total financial assets and total liabilities. And so there's a couple of observations here. One is we're actually in what's referred to a net debt position. So simply speaking, our financial assets are less than our financial liabilities. And if you think back to multiple budget presentations that I've made over the course of the last several years, a big part of our focus has been on debt and reserves. And so that's really what we're capturing here. The reason why we're in a net debt situation is partly because of the extent of borrowing that we have completed over the last, I'm going to say, 5 to 6 years. We also have some unfunded post-employment benefit liabilities, which, similar to most municipalities, have some to a certain extent. Ours are a little bit higher for reasons I'll get into in a minute. And we have relatively low reserve balances. And that means we have a lower, kind of cash and investment balances as well. And what that gives us then is this kind of net debt position. And, when we look at comparing ourselves to other regional municipalities, most of our comparators are in the opposite situation, where their financial assets exceed their liabilities. Now, this doesn't mean that there's reason to panic. It doesn't mean that there's we're solvent for lack of a better term. But what it does mean is that we do need to pay particular attention to both our borrowing and reserves. And that's why we've spent so much time on that through various budget presentations. And just to go into a little bit deeper, debt to reserve ratio is one of the common ratios that is used as a measure of financial health. We had significant increases back in 2013 and 2014. And this is in partly due to borrowing for Stage 1 LRT, also for the Kitchener wastewater treatment plant and other projects as well. So we peaked at just over 2 in 2014 and 2015. We are on, I'd say, a relatively slow, but certainly on a downhill trend, which is encouraging. And the reduction in 2019 is partly because of the increase in development charge reserve funds, which we reported on to committee last week. And then when we compare that ratio to some of our regional peers, you can see the increase through 13 and 14 stabilized, dropped a little bit this year, but we are significantly higher than most of our regional peers. And so this becomes a point of conversation, certainly every year through our credit rating review. And this is something that we'll obviously be reviewing with Moody's when we meet with them later in May. Debt servicing costs have also, as a result of the debt that we've issued, our debt servicing costs have increased. Roughly doubled since 2012 because of the debt that we have issued for a variety of projects. And the bottom point here on the left-hand side speaks to, again, some of the discussions we've had through Budget Committee, where, overall, we would say that our budget capacity to fund capital asset renewal is less than it should be. We have made some progress in the last couple of years and through the 2020 budget to help us with that. But we have been in a capital intensive period now for some time and have debt financed a significant component of those works. I suppose on the bright side, from an interest cost perspective, interest only makes up about 2.5% of our gross expenditure. And we've been fortunate that with this significant increase in debt that we've issued over the last several years, there's been no better time to do that issuance based on interest rates. We've seen that over the last several years, and we see that today. Interest rates are at or near historic lows again, and we are in the process of trying to get another debt issue into the market. It's just been particularly challenging over the last 4 to 6 weeks due to this extreme volatility that has been in place in the markets. From a regulatory perspective, the province allows for 25% of own source revenues to go towards principal and interest. Our overall debt servicing puts us right now between 10 and 11%. So, nowhere near that 25%. But again, it has been increasing over the last few years as we have increased the amount that we have borrowed. From a development charge perspective, as we reported last week, a significant increase in development charge reserves this year. In 2019, a big year for collections. And as a result, the 2019 reserve balances for DCs have come up. As we talked about during the budget process this year, our concern on the growth-related side is the amount of debt that we've issued so far and what our capital projection suggests that we'll issue. So far, and since 2012, we've issued about $224 million of growth-related debt. And our 5-year forecast would suggest another $262 million over the next 5 years. And so we started, I'm going to say 3 or 4 years ago, of a lot more discussion internally between finance, between TNES and our planning folks to look for ways to better plan the timing of the implementation of our infrastructure so that we weren't becoming overly reliant on debt servicing costs, on development charges as a source of funding. And of course, the concern there, as we've expressed before, is we end up with a contractual amount of debt servicing costs to pay from what can be a hard to predict revenue source. And you can see on the chart here, the blue line are the DC collections, and it just gives you some idea of the variation, if you will, from year to year in respect to how much we collect. $80 million in 2016, down closer to $50 million by 2018, then back up closer to 80 in 2019. So a little bit hard to predict. And that's kind of the risk that we're trying to manage, is that varying level of collections with a fixed amount of debt servicing costs. The other item that we should bring to Audit Committee's attention is the liability for retiree benefits. And this has been and continues to be A significant issue with respect to the Waterloo Region Police. As we've indicated here, Waterloo Region Police is one of the few remaining services that does have health benefits for life. And that's partly why the liability is to the extent that it is. So approximately $120 million future this is an actuarial determined liability. So I think the combination of the benefits that are provided for life with relatively low interest rates, both kind of combine to create this relatively high and this steadily increasing benefit, a retiree benefit, if you will. And you can see the trend over the last 6 years. The region is the darker blue piece at the bottom. It has increased relatively, I would say, at a slower rate. Our concern is predominantly here with respect to the valuation of the benefits for the police. And so when we look at, overall financial sustainability and the things that keep the finance folks, up at night, reliance on long-term debt for asset renewal, we're going to continue to keep a very, very close watch on that. I've spoken to the extent of development charge supported debt. Our reserve balances, again, compared to other municipalities, are relatively low. I think we need to spend some time with the police talking about the unfunded liabilities for post-employment benefits. And as the last 6 weeks have clearly shown, we want to make sure that we have some resilience in the face of unanticipated economic shocks like we're experiencing right now. And so on the, in terms of the things that we're doing to help, to reinforce and support the overall financial health of the region, spending a lot of time looking at our capital program, looking at the need for infrastructure, the timing of that infrastructure, and the associated costs, both in terms of growth-related infrastructure as well as the renewal of the existing infrastructure that we currently have in place. And again, trying to reduce the reliance on debt for the funding of both of those areas. And I think we took some important steps forward in 2019. One of them was approving increased development charge rates through the bylaw review in 2019. So I think that's helpful. There's obviously questions about how much growth and development are going to happen in the near term and into 2021, but approving those higher rates was helpful. We had some increases in the 2020 budget for our asset renewal funding strategy. And quite importantly, we adopted the first year of a 3-year funding strategy for development charge exemptions and discounts. On the operating side, again, some cost containment on the police side would be helpful. I think the reviews that we're doing through our lean process efficiency undertakings are going to be helpful as we go forward. And, as we do every year, our annual base budget review and reduction exercises, I think have always been helpful in terms of finding different ways of looking at our budget and finding those base budget reductions that we report on an annual basis. So again, key messages, increasing the budget capacity in the future to fund asset renewal and exemptions. We'll continue, of course, the internal work that we do to manage capital projects and operating budgets. Cost containment for benefits. We should continue to try to target an improved debt to reserve ratio. We do our ongoing review of development charge rates and policies. And again, looking for ways to ensure that we have the financial capacity to deal with economic shocks. So I would say, Madam Chair, those are from a staff perspective, those are kind of the key messages that we've taken from the audit. As Mr. Betik will get into shortly, it was a clean audit. We had a high degree of participation between staff and KPMG. And certainly happy to answer any questions from members of committee at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Dyer. I don't see any right now, so I'm wondering if we should welcome Matthew Betik from KPMG and have him review the audit. So
Okay.
welcome, Matthew.
Thank you. Happy to be here live from my basement. I'll share my screen in a moment as well, if that's okay, as I walk through the audit findings report.
That's great. Nice basement too, Matthew.
Well, thank you. I can't see it sharing, but it looks like it's there.
It is.
Okay, great. So I want to take a few minutes here to walk through our audit findings report. I will start off by saying, this the start of our audit field work, largely coincided with, the significant changes to, sort of social behavior as a result of the pandemic, and really want to commend, staff for how well they were responding to it relative to our audit process. Recognizing that, when you feel like you're in a crisis, sometimes the last thing anybody really cares about is the audit of a financial statements. But here we are on exactly the same timetable that we set up at the start of the process, and so that's a real feather in the cap to staff for doing that. As auditors, I said this to Craig and to his team, we have a bit of an advantage as this unfolded, because we're used to working in lots of different places, working remotely, having access to things without the physical paper. And so our transition into this really wasn't all that difficult relative to our client, who are folks that are used to being in the office every day, used to touching pieces of paper, and this all happened so suddenly, and they had to move to a different format. So, really want to express our gratitude for how well that came together. As we move through the presentation, on our executive summary, we do provide a bit of a outline as to what's still outstanding, and this is at the time that this report was presented or prepared for distribution. So we do have down here a handful of things that were outstanding back then. We have completed these two areas here, some of the remaining procedures around LRT revenue, as well as the consolidation process. In terms of legal letters, that process is still ongoing, but that's not unusual for this stage of the game, simply because we have to request that correspondence from the region's lawyers be received right up until the date we're ready to issue our report. So otherwise, we think everything is in good shape. And once we get through this process and get the statements approved, we'll be all ready to go. As Craig did mention, the audit opinion, the draft audit opinion that's attached to the statements, is a clean audit opinion. There's no modifications or qualifications, which is what you should expect and hope for. The other item that I would want to bring to your attention on this slide here is this sort of bottom section under control deficiencies. And we're happy to report that as a result of our work, we didn't find any significant deficiencies in internal control. So that is another, call it green check mark in the process. When we presented our audit plan, we were required to discuss with the committee the risks that may exist from fraud. And again, reminding the group that when we talk about fraud risk, we're talking about the intentional manipulation of the accounting records. At that time, we said there could be a risk from revenue recognition, which we didn't think was significant for a municipality, so we could sort of dispense with that risk. But we were required to consider the risk from the override of internal controls. And every single audit has to consider this risk. You're not unique in that we had to consider this. We do think the risk is low, especially on a relative basis to many organizations. And through our process and audit steps, we didn't find anything to report. As we move into some of the other areas of the audit, and these are areas of perhaps complexity or things we think should be of interest to the committee as they consider the financial statements. The first thing we'll talk about is the landfill closure and post-closure liability. So just to remind the committee that there is a calculation that's undertaken whereby the region looks at what it will cost to close the landfill liability and then to monitor that closure over an extended period of time. So we obviously have the West Waterloo site that's active, and then there's also the two inactive sites. Their locations escape me at the moment, but we have the three. Obviously, the largest portion relates to the active Waterloo site. From that liability, we do consider how much the site is used, or so what its capacity is. And I think the Waterloo capacity is approximately 66%, if my memory is somewhat accurate, which means the liability that's recorded on the financial statements for that one is about 66% of the total cost. We looked at the inputs that went into that calculation, and we're happy with it. I do want to just remind the group that in a couple of years, in 2022, there'll be a new standard to calculate this, and we're expecting to see the liability that's reported on the financial statements increase, which to Craig's presentation will make that sort of net debt figure look worse, but the underlying economic reality won't have changed. It will only be a change in how it's calculated and reported in the financial statements. On the next slide, we also talk about obligatory reserve funds, primarily the development charge reserve fund, because it is subject to legislation, but it's also subject to some judgment. And the reason for that is as monies are spent from the development charge reserve fund, we have to ensure that those are development related expenditures that were contemplated by the study by which the bylaw that sets the rates is ultimately passed. So we did go through that, and as well we confirmed that the amount of collections that the region received this year agreed to what the lower tier municipalities collected on your behalf. I will make a comment in the bottom section of the slide here, where we note that usually when DC funds are spent, there's typically revenue that's recorded in the financial statements in the revenue section. Remember that we don't show this as revenue in these statements when you collect it, we show it as revenue when you spend it. However, because there are these exemptions or discounted DCs, any amounts that go into the development charge reserve fund for exemptions or discounts are not shown as revenue ultimately. And so this was about a $10 million reclassification on the statement of operations, but it had no impact on the surplus for the year. On our next page, we do talk again about post-employment benefits, and so these are the ones for both the region proper and the police service. We note that, as Craig said, it is an actuarially determined figure, so there are a handful of estimates and judgments that are made. We made sure that the process by which the region determined those estimates made sense and was consistent. We also communicated directly with the region's appointed actuary, the School Boards Cooperative Inc., to make sure that things are being calculated properly. We also independently assessed the assumptions that are used and made sure they were all in accordance with the standard. A couple of quick notes. we note that, as Craig said, the discount rate on these future benefit liabilities declined in 2019. So that creates an actuarial loss, and that loss will be amortized over the next about 15 to 20 years. And so we'll expect to see greater expenses in the future starting next year. We also note that the police service central sick bank was dissolved, and that created a gain this year of about $3.3 million. The last slide of significant focus area is your accounting for capital. And certainly these are very, very large balances on your financial statements. And through our testing that we talked about at our planning meeting, we didn't find any differences or concerns there. On this slide, we really just identify some of the other major areas of our file. And again, no significant items came from that. As we discussed in our plan, we do use increasing number of software and technology tools in completing our audit. The most significant one now is something, the second area called data extraction and analytics. We use something called the CAP tool that can extract information directly from your system. And then we use that to analyze the data, looking for unusual or high-risk entries. And so I think my last specific comment will be on this page, where we do, communicate on an overall basis that the financial statements, in their form and content, are appropriate for the size and scope of the region. And just from a contextual perspective, appropriate is about the best you're going to get. That's a gold medal. So don't want anybody to think about that language and say, well, maybe it could be better than that. No, the statements are in good form. So there are a handful of other slides in our deck. They're really there for information, but I don't think they're significant to dive in with any depth. So I think of this, I'll pass it back over to the chair.
Thank you, Matthew. I have a couple of people that look like they have questions. Councillor Clark.
Sure.
Thank you, Chair. I'm not sure if this is a question for Matthew or perhaps for staff. And I appreciate that when you talked about fraud risk, you didn't really see any particularly. But I'm wondering what our policy is or our practices are with regards to cash payments on the user fee side, landfill fees or childcare fees or rent in our community housing. Do we accept cash payments? Do we have a maximum? How do we manage that?
Mr. Betik, can you speak to that, or should we ask Mr. Dyer?
I think maybe Craig would be better. Sorry, Craig.
Yeah, I can give it a try. So through you, Madam Chair, we accept cash in a number of different locations and services across the region. We have policies and procedures in place that govern the handling of that cash in those locations. The other thing that we've done over the last couple of years is we've conducted periodic, I'll say like internal audit reviews of areas where we have significant cash being transacted. So the waste manager, the landfill site is one of them, definitely. Other locations that we've looked at, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, Sunnyside, and I think housing as well. And there was one a little while ago, I believe, at POA. So we try to, look at areas on a rotating basis to make sure that our policies and procedures, internal controls are all up to speed.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Galloway.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. Matthew, is there any regulatory or statutory limit on how long you have to include the closed landfill sites? So for instance, the Kitchener landfill site, one of the two closed landfill sites, has probably been closed for close to 40 years. I know after 25 years of closure, it falls off some particular list within the Ministry of the Environment, that is. Do we keep those on the books forever?
Matthew?
Yeah, so as long as you have an obligation to continue to monitor the status of that site, and you will be incurring future costs, it will stay on the books.
Okay.
Craig is nodding. Do you want to jump in,
Yes.
Craig?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. To the extent that we expect to continue to monitor and incur costs, then those costs will form part of the calculation of the liability.
Okay, thanks.
Can I just tag on Councillor Galloway's question? Who decides that we no longer have to monitor? Is that the Ministry of Environment, or who makes that judgment call?
That I don't know the answer to.
I could give it a try. I suspect that there's an ongoing obligation. If there was to be a decision maker, there are likely perhaps some rules put out by the Ministry of the Environment, I suspect. But we could look into that and get a better answer for you.
Thank you. Councillor Galloway, any more questions?
No, that was it, Madam Chair.
I see no other questions. Matthew, thank you very much for a very cogent, and you tamped down your enthusiasm, but I'm glad that we were appropriate and adequate. I would entertain a motion for a recommendation moved by Councillor Strickland, seconded by Councillor Galloway, that the Regional Municipality of Waterloo approve the consolidated financial statements, the sinking fund financial statements, and the trust fund statements, all for the fiscal year ending December 31st, 2019, as set out in the report COR-FSD-20-12, dated April 22nd, 2020. All those would, if you could vote yes or no. That is carried. Thank you, colleagues. And thank you for the presentation, Mr. Dyer and Mr. Betik.
Thank you.
So
I would-
sorry, at this point, are we then signing off? I can't remember, or I'm not sure.
You will shortly, because I'm just going to entertain a motion to go into closed session. This is moved by Councillor Clark and seconded by Councillor Jowett. Councillor Galloway, do you have a question, or are you just ready to vote?
Ready to vote.
Okay, so all those in favor of going into close would please now signify. That is carried. So now we would say thank you, Matthew. You are excused.
So just before that, Madam Chair, I think at this point, it's typical for the audit committee to go into closed session with Mr. Betik to conduct any conversations you think are necessary or appropriate. So I think at this point, all of staff, with the exception of perhaps Tim, will exit the meeting.
Okay, thank you. Matthew, you're not off the hook. We would say goodbye to
Sure.
all the rest of staff.
And I've got Courtney Cheel as well as part of my team that will stay on as well.
Right.
Thank you.
Courtney's been silent but supportive in the background.
Sorry.
Okay.
She's always
Thank you,
like
Matt.
that.